July 26th, 1243. The slopes of Kösedağ are slick with the blood of the Seljuk army. As the Mongol cavalry wipes their blades and begins the grim task of counting the dead, they believe they have just secured total dominance over Anatolia. They believe they have crushed the Turkic spirit forever, turning a proud sultanate into a broken, tribute-paying shell. They were wrong. In fact, they couldn't have been more wrong. What the Mongols actually did that afternoon wasn't just an act of conquest. It was the ultimate act of accidental creation. They didn't know it yet, but by smashing the Sultanate of Rum into 1,000 jagged pieces, they had just triggered the greatest geopolitical butterfly effect in human history. They were the unwitting architects of their own eventual eclipse. Imagine the most terrifying war machine the world has ever seen, an unstoppable force that had leveled Baghdad, terrified the kings of Europe, and brought the emperors of China to their knees. Now, imagine that same force unintentionally clearing the path for a rival superpower that would outlive them by 5 centuries. An empire that would eventually seize the Queen of Cities, Constantinople, and push the borders of Islam to the very gates of Vienna. This is the ultimate paradox of the 13th century. Usually, when the Mongol hordes swept through a region, the story ended in ash and silence. But in the scorched valleys of Western Asia, the fire didn't just destroy, it forged. It created a perfect storm of chaos, desperate refugees, and power vacuums that allowed a small, insignificant border lord named Osman to do the impossible. How did the Mongol victory, a tactical masterpiece of horse archery and terror, turn into a strategic disaster that lost them control of the West? How did a wave of terrifying destruction provide the exact ingredients needed to build a global superpower? And most importantly, how did a handful of nomadic tribesmen fleeing the Mongol terror turn into the unstoppable Janissaries who would change the world forever? The history books tell you the Mongols won at Kösedağ, but the map of the modern world tells a different story. If the Mongols had stayed home, or if the Seljuks had won that day, the Ottoman Empire, the sword of Islam, might have remained a forgotten footnote. To understand the rise of the Ottomans, you have to look at the wreckage the Mongols left behind. You have to look at the vacuum, the fear, and the unintended consequences of a victory that was far too successful for its own good. This is how the greatest mistake in history built a superpower. This is the story of how the Mongol shadow birthed the Ottoman sun. History is often written as a series of deliberate conquests and calculated masterstrokes. But what if the greatest superpower of the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire, wasn't the result of a grand plan, but rather the accidental byproduct of a scorched earth invasion? Imagine it's 1243. The Mongol war machine, having already leveled cities from China to Eastern Europe, turns its sights on the mountains of Anatolia. At the Battle of Kösedağ, the Mongol generals didn't just defeat the Sultanate of Rum, they obliterated the status quo. To any observer at the time, this was the end of Turkic influence in the region. The Mongols were the ultimate destroyers of worlds. Their mission was simple: extract tribute, crush resistance, and leave a vacuum of power where civilizations used to stand. But here is the paradox. In their quest to secure total control over Western Asia, the Mongols inadvertently triggered a perfect storm of historical consequences that no one, not even Genghis Khan's successors, could have seen coming. By shattering the Seljuk Turks, the Mongols didn't bring stability. Instead, they created a chaotic frontier, a wild west of fractured principalities. They pushed waves of battle-hardened refugees and ambitious nomadic warriors westward, right to the doorstep of a crumbling Byzantine Empire. Among these refugees was a small, seemingly insignificant tribe led by a man named Osman. In this video, we aren't just looking at a timeline of battles. We are exploring one of history's most fascinating examples of systems thinking and the law of unintended consequences. We're going to look at how a Mongol victory, meant to secure an empire, actually laid the foundation for its greatest rival. We'll analyze how the destruction of central authority in Anatolia allowed a tiny border principality to evolve into a global superpower that would eventually last for 600 years and span 3 continents. How did the most feared conquerors in human history accidentally build the very empire that would eventually claim the title of caliphate? How did an act of total destruction become a singular act of creation? This is the story of the Battle of Kösedağ, the fall of the Seljuks, and the tectonic shifts in the 13th century that paved the way for Osman I to build a legacy out of the ashes. Welcome to a deep dive into the chaotic, unpredictable, and often ironic birth of the Ottoman Empire. This is how the Mongols, in their attempt to rule the world, accidentally created the force that would redefine it. To understand how the world's most efficient killing machine accidentally built its own worst nightmare, we have to look at the state of Anatolia in the immediate wake of 1243. When the dust settled at Kösedağ, the Mongol commander Byzantine didn't stay to build cities. Mongols didn't care for the administrative headaches of governing sedentary farmers or managing complex bureaucracies. Their philosophy was simpler: extract the wealth, break the pride, and ensure the local leaders were too terrified to ever look a Mongol emissary in the eye. The Sultanate of Rum, once the jewel of the Islamic world, was instantly reduced to a vassal state. This sounds like a dry political term, but for the people living there, it was a slow-motion apocalypse. The Seljuk Sultan, once a figure of absolute religious and political authority, was turned into a puppet. He was forced to pay a staggering tribute to the great Khan gold, silk, horses, and livestock that bled the Anatolian economy dry. Every year, a massive portion of the region's wealth disappeared into the Mongol treasury in the east. But here is where the systemic failure began. By turning the Seljuk Sultan into a hollow figurehead, the Mongols inadvertently cut the nervous system of Anatolian society. In the medieval world, the Sultan wasn't just a tax collector. He was the guarantor of order. He maintained the roads, protected the trade caravans, and most importantly, kept the various Turkic tribes from killing each other. When the Mongols smashed the Sultan's prestige, they didn't replace it with their own law. They governed through fear and distance. They stayed in their encampments in the east, leaving the central and western parts of Anatolia in a state of controlled chaos. It was a massive power vacuum, a geographical black hole where the old rules no longer applied and the new rules hadn't been written yet. Imagine a territory the size of France suddenly losing its central police force, its judicial system, and its economic stability, all while being flooded with thousands of desperate, armed refugees. Because while the Mongols were breaking the Seljuk state, they were also pushing a tidal wave of humanity toward the west. Years before the Battle of Kösedağ, the Mongol advance into Central Asia and Persia had already displaced millions. These weren't just random peasants. These were battle-hardened nomadic tribes, Sufi mystics, scholars, and Ghazis warrior monks who lived for the frontier. They were fleeing the scourge of God, and they had nowhere to go but the edge of the map. They were funneled into the narrow corridor of Anatolia, pressed up against the mountains and the sea. The Mongols were essentially the piston in a massive engine, compressing these Turkic tribes into a tiny, high-pressure zone on the Byzantine border. In physics, when you compress a gas into a smaller space, the temperature rises. In history, when you compress thousands of desperate, warlike refugees into a frontier, you get an explosion. This created the Beylik system, a collection of small, independent principalities. Each one was a tiny startup kingdom, led by a bey or local lord. These beyliks were constantly competing for resources, for glory, and for survival. It was a brutal, social Darwinist landscape. If you were weak, you were absorbed. If you were slow, you were destroyed. To the Mongols, these beyliks were insignificant. They were like ants fighting over crumbs at the edge of a picnic. Why would the great Khan, who ruled from Beijing to the Danube, care about a handful of nomadic chieftains in the rugged hills of Bithynia? To the Mongol administration, the real power was still the Seljuk Sultan in Konya, because he was the one who signed the checks. But they were looking at the wrong map. They were focusing on the official power, while the organic power was shifting to the fringes. The Mongols had created a world where the old elites, the scholars, the refined courtiers, the wealthy merchants of the cities were paralyzed by Mongol taxes and Mongol oversight. But the nomads on the frontier? They were too mobile to tax effectively, too decentralized to crush completely, and they had a powerful psychological advantage. They had already lost everything to the Mongols. They had nothing left to fear. In the center of Anatolia, the Seljuk state was rotting from the inside out, obsessed with internal coups and satisfying their Mongol masters. But on the fringes, a new kind of society was being forged in the fire of the frontier. This was a society built on merit, on military prowess, and on a fierce, fundamentalist religious drive. They were the Ghazis, and they saw themselves as the sword arm of Islam, standing on the last line of defense against the Christian Byzantines to the west and the pagan Mongols to the east. But even within this chaotic, wild west of beyliks, one specific group stood out. They weren't the largest. They weren't the richest. In fact, compared to the powerful beyliks of Karaman or Germian, the tribe of Osman was a footnote. They were settled in a tiny patch of land called Söğüt, right on the throat of the Byzantine Empire. Why did this one tiny tribe survive and eventually devour the world, while the others faded into history? The answer lies in a strange irony of geography. Most of the other Turkic beyliks were trapped. To their east were the Mongols, an invincible wall of iron. To their west and south were other Turkic beyliks. They were stuck fighting their own brothers for scraps of land. But Osman's tribe had a blue ocean strategy. They were positioned at the UC, the absolute edge. To their west lay the crumbling remains of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were weak, distracted by their own civil wars and their hatred of the Latin Crusaders. For Osman, the path to expansion wasn't blocked by the Mongols. It was an open door to the riches of Europe. This is the first great irony. The Mongols pushed the Turks so far west that they accidentally gave the most ambitious tribe the keys to the richest kingdom in the world. However, there is a deeper mystery here. Why didn't the Mongols just ride a few hundred miles further and finish the job? Why didn't they crush Osman before he could even start? They had the horses, they had the numbers, they had conquered much tougher terrain. The history books often say the Mongols just lost interest in Anatolia, or that the terrain was too mountainous for their style of warfare. But that's a simplification. The truth is far more sinister and far more complex. The Mongols didn't just stop because they were tired. They stopped because the very system they used to conquer the world, their absolute, terrifying efficiency, had started to cannibalize itself. The Mongol Empire was a victim of its own success, and the cracks that began to appear in their armor were the exact openings Osman needed to build his foundation. But wait, before we look at the rise of Osman, we have to address a massive misconception. We often think of the Mongols and the Turks as two completely separate entities, a clash of civilizations. We see it as a story of the conquerors versus the conquered. But what if I told you that the Mongol army that destroyed Anatolia was actually made up of nearly 90% Turks? What if the Mongol victory at Kösedağ was actually a case of Turks fighting Turks under a Mongol flag? This changes everything. It means the birth of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just a reaction to a foreign invasion. It was a civil war for the soul of the Turkic people. The Mongols didn't just create the Ottomans by accident. They provided the genetic material, the military tactics, and the sheer human power that Osman would eventually use to turn back and defy the very empire that had displaced his ancestors. The Mongols thought they were the masters of the world, but in reality, they were just the delivery service. They were transporting the most dangerous military culture in history from the steppes of Central Asia and dropping it right on the doorstep of Europe. And then, just as the Turks were reaching their boiling point, the Mongol Empire did something truly unexpected, something that would leave Anatolia completely wide open for a new predator to take the throne. To understand how the world's most efficient killing machine accidentally built its own worst nightmare, we have to look at the state of Anatolia in the immediate wake of 1243. When the dust settled at Kösedağ, the Mongol commander Baiju Noyan didn't stay to build cities or establish a new legal code. The Mongols didn't care for the administrative headaches of governing sedentary farmers or managing complex, multi-layered bureaucracies. Their philosophy was brutal in its simplicity. Extract the wealth, break the pride, and ensure the local leaders were too terrified to ever look a Mongol emissary in the eye. The Sultanate of Rum, once the jewel of the Islamic world and a center of high culture, was instantly reduced to what historians call a vassal state. This sounds like a dry political term, but for the millions of people living across the Anatolian plateau, it was a slow-motion apocalypse. The Seljuk Sultan, once a figure of absolute religious and political authority, a man who claimed to be the shadow of God on earth, was turned into a hollow puppet. He was forced to pay a staggering annual tribute to the Great Khan: gold, silk, horses, and livestock that effectively bled the Anatolian economy dry. Every year, a massive portion of the region's productive wealth simply disappeared, packed onto carts, and sent east into the bottomless Mongol treasury. But here is where the systemic failure of the Mongol victory began. By turning the Seljuk Sultan into a figurehead, the Mongols inadvertently severed the nervous system of Anatolian society. In the medieval world, the Sultan wasn't just a tax collector. He was the guarantor of the Pax Islamica. He maintained the roads. He protected the massive trade caravans that connected the Silk Road to Europe. And most importantly, he kept the hundreds of volatile Turkic tribes from killing each other. When the Mongols smashed the Sultan's prestige, they didn't replace it with their own law. They governed through fear and distance. They stayed in their massive encampments in the east, in the Mughal Plain, leaving the central and western parts of Anatolia in a state of controlled chaos. It was a massive power vacuum, a geographical black hole where the old rules no longer applied and the new rules hadn't been written yet. Imagine a territory the size of France suddenly losing its central police force, its judicial system, and its economic stability. all while being flooded with thousands of desperate, armed refugees. This is the part of the story most people miss. While the Mongols were breaking the Seljuk state, they were also acting as a giant human piston, pushing a tidal wave of humanity toward the west. For decades, the Mongol advance into Central Asia and Persia had been displacing millions. These weren't just random peasants. These were battle-hardened nomadic tribes, Sufi mystics, displaced scholars, and Ghazis warrior monks who lived for the frontier. They were fleeing the scourge of God, and they had nowhere to go but the very edge of the map. They were funneled into the narrow corridor of Anatolia, pressed up against the mountains and the sea. The Mongols were essentially compressing these Turkic tribes into a tiny, high-pressure zone right on the Byzantine border. In physics, when you compress a gas into a smaller space, the temperature rises. In history, when you compress thousands of desperate, warlike refugees into a frontier, you get an explosion. This pressure created what historians call the Beylik system, a collection of dozens of small, independent principalities. Each one was a tiny startup kingdom, led by a bey, or local lord. These beyliks were constantly competing for resources, for glory, and for survival. It was a brutal, social Darwinist landscape. If you were weak, you were absorbed. If you were slow, you were destroyed. To the Mongols, these beyliks were insignificant. They were like ants fighting over crumbs at the edge of a picnic. Why would the great Khan, who ruled from Beijing to the Danube, care about a handful of nomadic chieftains in the rugged, rain-swept hills of Bithynia? To the Mongol administration, the real power was still the Seljuk Sultan in Konya, because he was the one who signed the tribute checks. But they were looking at the wrong map. They were focusing on the official power, while the organic power was shifting to the fringes. The Mongols had created a world where the old elites, the scholars, the refined courtiers, the wealthy merchants of the cities, were paralyzed by Mongol taxes and oversight. But the nomads on the frontier, they were too mobile to tax effectively, too decentralized to crush completely, and they had a powerful psychological advantage. They had already lost everything to the Mongols. They had nothing left to fear. In the center of Anatolia, the Seljuk state was rotting from the inside out, obsessed with internal coups and satisfying their Mongol masters. But on the fringes, a new kind of society was being forged in the fire. This was a society built on merit, on military prowess, and on a fierce, fundamentalist religious drive. They were the Ghazis, and they saw themselves as the sword arm of Islam, standing on the last line of defense against the Christian Byzantines to the west and the pagan Mongols to the east. But even within this chaotic, wild west of beyliks, one specific group stood out. They weren't the largest, they weren't the richest. In fact, compared to the powerful beyliks of Karaman or Germian, the tribe of Osman was a footnote, a rounding error in the Mongol ledgers. They were settled in a tiny patch of land called Soyut, right on the throat of the Byzantine Empire. Why did this one tiny tribe survive and eventually devour the world, while the others, many of whom were far more powerful at the start, faded into history? The answer lies in a strange irony of geography. Most of the other Turkic beyliks were trapped. To their east were the Mongols, an invincible wall of iron. To their west and south were other Turkic beyliks. They were stuck in a zero-sum game, fighting their own brothers for scraps of land. But Osman's tribe had what modern business theorists call a blue ocean strategy. They were positioned at the UC, the absolute edge. To their west, lay the crumbling remains of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were weak, distracted by their own civil wars and their lingering hatred of the Latin Crusaders who had sacked Constantinople decades earlier. For Osman, the path to expansion wasn't blocked by the invincible Mongol horsemen. It was an open door to the riches of Europe. The Mongols pushed the Turks so far west that they accidentally gave the most ambitious, most radical tribe the keys to the richest kingdom in the world. They thought they were pinning the Turks against the sea to drown them. Instead, they were handing them a launch pad. However, there is a deeper mystery here that challenges everything we think we know about this era. Why didn't the Mongols just ride a few hundred miles further and finish the job? They had the horses. They had the numbers. They had conquered much tougher terrain in the Himalayas and the Caucasus. The history books often say the Mongols just lost interest in Anatolia, or that the terrain was too mountainous for their style of warfare. But that's a massive oversimplification. The truth is that the Mongol Empire didn't just stop. It began to undergo a transformation so radical that it blurred the lines between the conqueror and the conquered. We often think of the Mongols and the Turks as two completely separate entities, a clash of civilizations between the steppe and the city. We see it as a story of a foreign invader crushing a local people. But here is the fact that flips the entire narrative on its head. The Mongol army that destroyed the Turks at Kösedağ was actually made up of nearly 90% Turks. The generals were Mongol, the banners were Mongol, and the high command followed the Yasa of Genghis Khan. But the men holding the bows, the men charging the lines, and the men who stayed behind to occupy the land were the cousins and brothers of the people they were supposedly conquering. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a violent, chaotic restructuring of the Turkic world itself. The birth of the Ottoman Empire wasn't a reaction to a foreign invasion. It was the final result of a civil war for the soul of the Turkic people. The Mongols didn't just create the Ottomans by accident. They provided the genetic material, the military tactics, and the sheer human power that Osman would eventually use to turn back and defy the very empire that had displaced his ancestors. The Mongols thought they were the masters of the world, but in reality, they were just the delivery service. They were transporting the most dangerous military culture in history from the steppes of Central Asia and dropping it right on the doorstep of Europe. And then, just as this pressure cooker was reaching its boiling point, the Mongol Empire did something truly unexpected. It didn't just leave a vacuum. It started to become the very thing it had tried to destroy. For decades, the Mongols had a strict policy: conquer, extract, and remain separate. They were the apex predators. You don't socialize with your prey. But history has a funny way of dealing with apex predators. If you stay in one place long enough, the environment changes you. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Ilkhanate, the massive breakaway state ruling over Persia and Anatolia, did the unthinkable. They assimilated. The conquerors were conquered by the culture of the vanquished. In 1295, the Mongol ruler Ghazan Khan publicly converted to Islam. He didn't just change his religion, he changed the entire operational software of the Mongol state in the Middle East. They started speaking Persian. They adopted Islamic administrative systems. They became the very sedentary rulers they used to hunt. You'd think a massive Islamic Mongol superpower would instantly crush any independent Turkic upstarts like Osman. You'd think this was game over for the Beyliks. It wasn't. It was the catalyst for their ultimate freedom. Because converting to Islam didn't unite the Mongol world. It fractured it permanently. To the north, The Golden Horde, another massive Mongol Khanate, was furious. Suddenly, the Mongols weren't fighting the world anymore. They were fighting each other. The Ilkhanate locked horns with the Golden Horde in a series of grueling, endless border wars over the Caucasus. The terrifying Mongol war machine turned its blades inward. And just like that, the eye of Sauron looked away from Anatolia. The tribute collectors stopped showing up. The punitive raids ceased. The iron grip of the Ilkhanate went slack. This was the exact microsecond of historical opportunity Osman had been waiting for. The Mongols had cleared the board, pushed his people to the absolute most profitable piece of real estate on earth, and then politely distracted themselves with a civil war. But a distracted enemy doesn't build an empire for you. It just gives you breathing room. Osman still had a massive problem. He was leading a ragtag band of nomadic herdsmen. If he just kept raiding Byzantine villages, his name would have vanished into the footnotes of a Greek chronicle. He needed an engine for infinite growth. So, Osman did something radical. He threw out the traditional tribal playbook. In the medieval world, power was tied to blood. If you weren't part of the right family, the right clan, or the right religion, you were nothing. Osman realized that exclusivity was a bottleneck. If he wanted to grow fast, he couldn't afford to be genetically tribal, and he couldn't afford to be religiously intolerant. He turned his tiny beylik into the 13th century equivalent of an aggressive tech startup. He created an absolute meritocracy. Osman opened his doors to everyone. He welcomed displaced Turkic warriors, sure, but he also welcomed Sufi mystics looking for a cause. He welcomed fleeing scholars who needed a patron, and most shockingly, he welcomed Christians. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled, its local governors and generals were left unpaid and unsupported by Constantinople. Osman didn't just fight these Christian commanders, he pitched them. He offered them land, wealth, and status if they rode with him. And they did. One of Osman's closest allies and top generals was Kosa Mihal, a Byzantine Greek Christian, who eventually converted to Islam, but started fighting for Osman long before he did. This was the secret sauce. Osman wasn't just a conqueror, he was an assimilator. The Mongols wiped out local talent. Osman recruited it. By blending the ferocity of Turkic horse archers with the tactical knowledge of defecting Byzantine generals, Osman created a terrifying hybrid military. He was using the scraps left behind by two dying empires to build a new one. But to cross the threshold from a highly successful warlord to a true state, Osman needed one more thing. He needed a capital. He needed a city. Nomads don't build empires. They build massive temporary spheres of influence that pop the moment the leader dies. Look at Genghis Khan. Look at Attila the Hun. If Osman wanted his legacy to survive, he had to teach his restless horse-riding warriors to do the one thing they hated most: sit still. He set his sights on Bursa, a massive, heavily fortified Byzantine jewel sitting at the base of Mount Uludağ. This wasn't a village you could raid in an afternoon. This was an impregnable fortress. The siege of Bursa took years. It was a grueling, agonizing test of willpower. Osman's forces literally had to learn siegecraft on the fly. They starved the city, built observation towers, and choked off its supply lines. Osman himself grew old and sick during the siege. He never actually saw the city fall. He died just before Bursa surrendered in 1326. But his dying wish was fulfilled. He was buried in Bursa. The city became the first true capital of the Ottoman state. And this is where the ultimate historical inversion takes place. The capture of Bursa wasn't just a military victory. It was the exact moment the Ottomans weaponized the Mongols' greatest weakness against them. The Mongol doctrine was built on extraction. Burn the city, take the gold, leave the ashes. They were brilliant at breaking institutions, but terrible at building them. Once the Mongols broke the Seljuk state, they didn't replace the roads, the courts, or the markets. They left a void. Osman's son, Orhan, looked at Bursa and did the exact opposite of a Mongol Khan. He didn't burn it, he invested in it. He built mosques, schools, public baths, and soup kitchens. He minted the first Ottoman silver coins. He established a legal code. He created the exact thing the Mongols had destroyed at Kösedağ: central institutional stability. People didn't just flock to the Ottomans out of fear. They flocked to them because the Ottomans were the only ones offering a functional society in a world gone mad. They were providing security in a post-apocalyptic landscape. The Mongols brought the apocalypse. The Ottomans built the bunker. But a new capital and a new currency weren't enough. The Mongols had proven that an empire relying on tribal loyalties will eventually tear itself apart. Orhan, and later his son Murad, knew that as their borders expanded, the tribal chiefs who had helped Osman build this state would become too powerful. They would demand more. They would rebel. It's the classic dictator's trap. The men who put you in power are the men most likely to take you out. To break the cycle, the Ottomans had to engineer a military unit that had never been seen before. Something so ruthlessly efficient, so perfectly designed, that it would make the Mongol horse archers look obsolete. They needed an army that had no family, no tribal affiliations, and no loyalty to anyone but the Sultan. This realization birthed the single most controversial, terrifying, and effective military institution of the medieval world: the Devshirme system, the blood tax. The Ottomans began conscripting young Christian boys from the recently conquered Balkans. They took them from their families, converted them to Islam, and subjected them to years of grueling physical and psychological training. They stripped away their past and built them a new future. These boys were legally the slaves of the Sultan, but practically, they became the elite masters of the empire. They became the Janissaries. This was Europe's first standing professional army since the Roman Empire. While French and English kings were still begging their petty lords to supply part-time peasant militias for a few weeks of summer campaigning, the Ottoman Sultan had thousands of highly disciplined, salaried, fanatic infantrymen training year-round in the capital. The Janissaries were the ultimate patch for the Mongol bug. The Mongols fell apart because their generals were essentially independent warlords with their own bases of power. A Janissary had no base of power. His wealth, his status, his very life came directly from the Sultan's hand. He couldn't overthrow the system because he was the system. By the late 14th century, the geopolitical board had flipped entirely. The Mongol Ilkhanate? Gone. Collapsed under the weight of its own internal rot. The Byzantine Empire? A hollowed-out ghost clinging to the walls of Constantinople. And the Ottomans? They were no longer a band of desperate refugees hiding in the hills. They were an unstoppable machine. They crossed the Dardanelles. They planted their flag in Europe. They were swallowing the Balkans whole. The Mongol invasion of 1243 was supposed to be the end of Turkic sovereignty. Instead, it acted as a brutal, evolutionary crucible. It burned away the stagnant, bloated bureaucracy of the Seljuks and replaced it with a lean, hungry, ultra-adaptive predator. But history is rarely a straight line. Just as the Ottomans were about to cement their status as the undisputed masters of the East and West, just as they were preparing to snuff out the light of Constantinople once and for all, the ghost of the Mongol Empire returned. The universe wasn't quite done with the Ottomans yet. They had learned how to survive the Mongol shadow. They had learned how to build in its ruins. But they hadn't yet proven they could survive a direct collision with the reincarnation of Genghis Khan himself. Everything the Ottomans had built over a century, the wealth of Bursa, the discipline of the Janissaries, the momentum of their European conquests, was about to be thrown into the fire. A man was marching from the east. A man who made the slaughter at Kösedağ look like a minor skirmish. The ultimate test of the Ottoman survival machine had arrived. His name was Timur. You probably know him as Tamerlane, the sword of Islam. He claimed to be the rightful heir to Genghis Khan, but he possessed a calculated cruelty that made his nomadic ancestors look remarkably restrained. He didn't just conquer cities, he erased them from the historical record. He built massive pyramids out of human skulls in Delhi, turned the golden age of Baghdad into a graveyard, and burned the ancient, bustling city of Damascus to ashes. To Timur, the Ottoman Sultan wasn't a peer. He was an insolent, insignificant border guard who had forgotten his place. Timur's empire stretched from the frozen borders of China to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. He commanded a vast, unified Turco-Mongol horde that struck with the blinding speed of lightning and the crushing weight of an avalanche. And in 1402, he turned his terrifying gaze westward. The Ottoman ruler standing in his way was Sultan Bayezid I, his nickname, the Thunderbolt. Bayezid was the very definition of imperial arrogance. He had just annihilated a massive combined European crusader army at the Battle of Nicopolis. He was actively starving out the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. He had never tasted defeat, and he believed his new, modernized army was invincible. When Timur sent an envoy demanding that the Ottomans submit and pay tribute, Bayezid didn't just say no. He sent back a deeply insulting letter, challenging Timur's manhood, threatening his wives, and daring the steppe warlord to invade. It was the deadliest typo in human history. Timur obliged. He marched an army of nearly 140,000 battle-hardened veterans into the heart of Anatolia. Bayezid, furious and overconfident, lifted the siege of Constantinople and raced his forces east to meet him. They collided in July 1402 on the dusty plains of Ankara. This wasn't just a battle. It was the clash of the century. It was the ultimate test of the new, sedentary nomadic hybrid Ottoman machine against the pure, undiluted terror of the steppe horde. But Timur didn't just outfight Bayezid. He entirely outmaneuvered him. Before the battle even started, Timur captured the only water source in the valley. He actually dammed a river and redirected its flow away from the Ottoman camps. In the blistering, suffocating heat of the Anatolian summer, Bayezid's men were dying of thirst before a single arrow was ever fired. But the killing blow didn't come from a Mongol sword. It came from a devastating psychological trick. Remember those independent Turkic beyliks that Osman and his descendants had absorbed? They never truly forgot their old loyalties. When the battle lines engaged, Timur raised the ancient, terrifying banners of the steppe. The tribal Turkic cavalry in Bayezid's army looked at those familiar banners, looked at the overwhelming numbers of Timur's horde, and made a cold, calculated decision. They switched sides, right in the middle of the battle. In an instant, Bayezid's right flank evaporated. The Ottoman army violently collapsed in on itself. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, the supreme terror of Europe, was captured alive on the battlefield. He became the first and only Ottoman Sultan in history to be taken prisoner in combat. He spent the rest of his short, miserable life in a gilded iron cage, paraded around as Timur's personal trophy. to the kings of Europe and the scholars of the East, this was it. The story was over. The Ottoman experiment had just been violently discontinued. Timur executed the exact same playbook the Mongols had used at Kösedağ a century and a half earlier. He smashed the central authority. He looted the Ottoman treasury in Bursa until the vaults were bare. He gave the conquered lands back to the petty tribal chieftains, and then, satisfied that the threat was neutralized, he turned his massive army around and marched back east to prepare for an invasion of China. He left Bayezid's 4 sons behind to fight over the bleeding scraps. What followed was the Ottoman interregnum, a decade of brutal, fratricidal civil war. The empire was shattered into jagged pieces. Brothers assassinated brothers. The newly conquered European territories rebelled. The Anatolian provinces declared independence. By all the conventional rules of geopolitics, the Ottoman state should have died right there in the dust of Ankara. But it didn't. And understanding why it didn't is the key to understanding how a true global superpower is forged. Why did the Mongol playbook completely destroy the Seljuks, but fail miserably against the Ottomans? Because the Ottomans had built a bunker. The Seljuk state had been a fragile glass pyramid. When the Mongols smashed the top, the whole structure shattered. But Orhan and Murad hadn't just built a military. They had built a highly redundant institutional machine. They built a system that could survive without a head. While the Ottoman princes were busy slaughtering each other in the field, the silent machinery of the state kept humming. The local governors kept issuing decrees in the name of the House of Osman. The tax collectors quietly kept gathering grain. The courts kept functioning. The silver currency held its value in the markets. The common people didn't abandon the Ottomans. They actively clung to them because the Ottoman administrative system was still the only thing standing between them and total apocalyptic anarchy. But the real shock absorber, the ultimate fail-safe, the Janissaries. Timur was able to bribe the tribal horsemen. He could buy the loyalty of the nomadic beys, but he couldn't buy the Devshirme. The Janissaries had no tribes to return to. They had no independent wealth, no hidden lands, no family name to protect. They were legally tied to the Sultanate itself. If the House of Osman fell, the Janissaries lost everything. So they held the line. They anchored the sinking ship. They threw their collective terrifying weight behind one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmed I, and ruthlessly crushed the remaining factions. In 1413, Mehmed I emerged from the bloodbath as the sole sultan. The empire was bleeding, exhausted, and deeply humiliated. But it was alive, and it was about to become infinitely more dangerous. The Battle of Ankara was a near-lethal injection, but it functioned as a geopolitical vaccine. The Ottomans survived the infection, and their systemic immune system adapted with terrifying speed. They looked at the disaster at Ankara and identified the fatal point of failure: tribal loyalty. The nomadic cavalry had betrayed them. So, the Ottomans made a ruthless, permanent pivot. They were done relying on the unpredictable horsemen of the steppe. They aggressively expanded the Devshirme system. They poured massive funding into the Janissary Corps. They shifted their entire military doctrine away from the ancient, sweeping cavalry tactics of the East, and fully embraced the bleeding edge of the future. They embraced gunpowder. They embraced massed infantry. They embraced artillery. The Mongols and Timur had effectively bullied the Ottomans into becoming a modern, centralized military state. They forced them to strip away the last remaining vestiges of their nomadic past. The Ottomans were no longer a loose confederation of warriors. They were a standardized, highly lethal bureaucracy armed with cannons. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman war machine had been entirely rebuilt, upgraded, and heavily bug-tested by the most brutal conquerors in history. They were done being the victims of the East. They were done running from the ghosts of the steppe. It was time to collect on a promise Osman had made over a century ago. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, the great-grandson of the man who died in Timur's cage, marched an army to the walls of Constantinople. He didn't bring tribal horse archers. He brought massive bronze cannons capable of shattering stone walls that had stood uninterrupted for 1,000 years. He brought highly disciplined, musket-wielding infantry who moved with the silent, terrifying precision of a machine. The Byzantine emperor looked out from the walls of the Queen of Cities and saw an army that defied logic. An army that was born from the wreckage of a Mongol invasion, tempered in the fires of a brutal civil war, and forged into the ultimate engine of conquest. When those legendary walls finally fell, the shockwave echoed from the palaces of Paris to the courts of Beijing. The Roman Empire was dead. The Ottoman Empire had officially arrived on the world stage, not as a desperate border state, but as a dominant superpower. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. Genghis Khan and his successors believed they were clearing the chessboard. They believed their policy of total destruction would ensure eternal Mongol supremacy. They burned the libraries, slaughtered the sultans, and pushed millions of desperate refugees into the narrow, mountainous bottleneck of Anatolia. They thought they were burying their enemies. They didn't realize they were planting a seed. They compressed the most ambitious, warlike elements of the Turkic world into a tiny pressure cooker, right on the edge of a crumbling European empire. They destroyed the bloated, inefficient local governments, leaving a vacuum that could only be filled by extreme meritocracy. And a century later, Timur returned to stress test this new creation, inadvertently forcing it to abandon its final weaknesses and evolve into an unstoppable, centralized gunpowder empire. Every time the nomadic conquerors from the east tried to crush the Turks in Anatolia, they only succeeded in making them stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The Mongols were the ultimate apex predators. But in their sheer, unthinking efficiency, they acted as the brutal midwives to an empire that would outlive them by over half a millennium. An empire that would eventually stretch from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean, dictating global politics, controlling world trade, and terrifying the kings of Europe for generations. You cannot separate the fall of Kösedağ from the rise of Constantinople. One is the direct, unavoidable consequence of the other. It is the perfect historical proof that raw power without long-term vision is a very dangerous game. When you break a system without replacing it, you don't get peace. You get a vacuum. And you never know what kind of monster is going to crawl out of the dark to fill it. The ashes of Constantinople were still smoldering in 1453 when the rest of the world realized a horrifying truth. Taking the Byzantine capital wasn't the finale of the Ottoman project. It was barely the prologue. For 2 centuries, the Christian kings of Europe had viewed the Turks as a regional nuisance, a persistent border problem. But when Mehmed the Conqueror rode his horse into the Hagia Sophia, the geopolitical reality violently shifted. The Ottomans were no longer just a threat to Europe. They were a global catastrophe. But Mehmed didn't just want to be an emperor of the West. He wanted to be the undisputed master of the Islamic world. And to achieve that, the Ottomans had to succeed exactly where the Mongols had utterly failed. Back in 1260, the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine suffered its first real, shattering defeat at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The people who broke the Mongol aura of invincibility? The Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks were the elite of the elite, a fiercely proud, aristocratic cavalry empire that controlled the immense wealth of the Nile and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They believed they were the true, ordained protectors of the Islamic faith. They looked at the Ottomans as uncultured, dirt-poor upstarts from the rugged hills of Anatolia. They thought they could dismiss the descendants of Osman, just like they had dismissed the descendants of Genghis Khan. They were about to learn what a century of hyper-evolution actually looks like. In 1517, under the command of Sultan Selim the Grim, the Ottoman war machine marched across the unforgiving Sinai Desert. The Mongols had tried this exact route, and their supply lines broke. Selim didn't break. He brought thousands of camels, a meticulously planned logistical network, and something the Mamluks fundamentally refused to understand: field artillery. When the two greatest military forces in the Islamic world finally collided at the Battle of Radania, the Mamluks charged with their lances and swords. They executed the exact same brilliant, sweeping cavalry tactics that had once crushed the Mongol horde. But tactics don't matter when the physics of war change. The Janissary infantry didn't even flinch. They raised their matchlock muskets and unleashed a volley of lead that tore the Mamluk aristocracy to shreds in a matter of hours. The battle wasn't a contest. It was an execution. Selim the Grim didn't just defeat the Mamluk Empire. He deleted it from the map. In a single, ruthless campaign, the Ottomans doubled their territory. They took Cairo, they took Jerusalem, they took Damascus. But the real prize wasn't land or gold. It was the ultimate ideological weapon. When Selim returned to Istanbul, he brought the title of Caliph with him. The transformation was absolute. The descendants of terrified, displaced nomads running from the Mongol terror were now the spiritual and political leaders of the global Islamic faith. They had absorbed the Byzantine Empire. They had absorbed the Mamluk Empire. They had successfully weaponized the ashes of the old world. And this monopoly was about to break the global economy in half. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had formed a massive, impenetrable wall across the center of the known world. They controlled the Black Sea. They controlled the Levant. They controlled the Red Sea. They had effectively monopolized the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean spice routes. If you were a European merchant, a Venetian banker, or a Spanish king, and you wanted to buy pepper, silk, medicine, or porcelain from Asia, you had to pay the Ottoman toll, and the Ottomans didn't just want a cut, they wanted leverage. This wasn't just a tax. It was an existential threat to the Christian kingdoms of the West. Every time a European bought spices, they were bleeding silver into the Ottoman treasury. They were literally funding the very Janissary armies that were actively besieging Vienna and raiding the coasts of Italy. Europe was paying for its own execution. They had to find a back door. They had to bypass the Ottoman wall. This absolute suffocating desperation triggered the greatest gamble in human history. We are often taught in school that the age of discovery was driven by bold explorers looking for scientific progress and adventure. It wasn't. It was driven by sheer, unadulterated panic. Portuguese captains started edging their fragile caravels down the deadly, unmapped coast of Africa, risking storms and starvation just to find a sea route to India. And a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus convinced the Spanish crown to let him sail off the edge of the map, heading west into the terrifying Atlantic. Columbus wasn't looking for a new world. He was running from the Ottomans. Think about the sheer mind-bending scale of this historical butterfly effect. In 1243, a Mongol general decided to brutally crush a Turkish sultanate at the Battle of Kösedağ. That localized violence created a power vacuum in Anatolia. That vacuum birthed the ambitious tribe of Osman. The Ottomans expanded into a hyper-militarized state that eventually monopolized global trade. That monopoly choked the European economy, and that economic chokehold forced Europe to take to the oceans. Those desperate ocean voyages led to the discovery of the Americas, the colonization of the globe, and the birth of the modern, interconnected world. If the Mongols had lost at Kösedağ, or if they had actually bothered to establish a stable government in Anatolia instead of leaving a chaotic void, the Ottomans would never have existed. The Silk Road would have remained fragmented but open. The massive economic pressure on Europe would never have materialized. The ships that crossed the Atlantic might never have been built. The Mongol bow inadvertently launched the European galleon. But history has a brutal sense of irony. It doesn't allow any empire to escape the laws of gravity. The Ottomans had engineered a system specifically designed to survive chaos. But what happens to a survival machine when it actually wins? What happens to a bunker when the apocalypse is finally over? Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire reached its absolute zenith. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic superpower with the most advanced bureaucracy, the most feared military, and a legal code that was centuries ahead of its time. To the outside observer, the Ottoman state looked immortal. But hidden deep inside the palace walls, the very mechanisms that made them invincible began to secretly mutate. The Ottomans had designed their entire state around infinite expansion. The Devshirme system, the Meritocracy, the Janissaries, they all required new conquests, new loot, and new lands to sustain themselves. When the empire reached its natural geographical limits, halted by the vastness of the Iranian plateau to the east, the deep Sahara to the south, and the fortified walls of Vienna to the west, the machine stopped expanding. And when a machine built for war stops moving forward, it begins to eat itself. Remember the Janissaries? The enslaved, fanatic super soldiers who saved the empire from Timur? They were designed to be the ultimate patch for the Mongol bug. Men with no property, no families, and no loyalties except to the Sultan. But power is a fluid dynamic. As the empire stabilized and the Sultan stopped leading armies into battle, opting instead to stay inside the luxurious confines of the Topkapi Palace, the Janissaries realized a terrifying truth. They were the ones holding the guns. The Sultan wasn't their master anymore. He was their dependent. The ultimate fail-safe slowly morphed into the ultimate parasite. Without an existential threat to fight, the Janissaries turned their terrifying discipline inward. They started demanding higher pay. They demanded the right to marry. They demanded the right to enroll their own children into the elite corps, entirely destroying the pure meritocracy that Osman had built. The strict, ruthless system of promotion based on skill began to rot into the exact same bloated nepotism that had destroyed the Seljuks centuries earlier. The Ottomans had successfully built a machine to survive the Mongols, but they couldn't figure out how to survive themselves. When a Janissary overturned his massive brass soup kettle in the barracks, it was the traditional signal of mutiny. And by the 17th century, those kettles were overturning far too often. Sultans who tried to reform the military were dragged from their palaces and strangled by their own elite guards. the Ottoman state didn't fall to a foreign conqueror. It became a hostage in its own capital. History is a massive graveyard of empires that thought they had finally figured out the formula for eternal dominance. The Mongols thought their terror was absolute. The Ottomans thought their system was unbreakable. But the truth of geopolitics is far more chaotic. Power is never truly destroyed. It just shifts to the edges. It hides in the vacuums. It waits in the ashes. The Mongols tried to break the medieval world to ensure they would rule it forever. Instead, they acted as the brutal, unwitting midwives to an empire that would outlast them by half a millennium and force humanity to map the rest of the globe. They proved that raw military supremacy is an illusion if you don't understand the system you are destroying. You can conquer the board. You can slaughter the king. You can salt the earth. But you can never, ever predict the consequences of the game. But here is where the story takes its final, most terrifying twist. Because history doesn't just move in a straight line. It moves in cycles. And the Ottoman cycle was about to violently reset. By the 19th century, the ultimate survival bunker had become a prison. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the apex predator of Europe. It was widely mocked as the sick man of Europe. The exact same institutional rot that ate the Seljuk Sultanate from the inside out was now eating the House of Osman. The sultans were trapped in their palaces, disconnected from the reality of their borders. The imperial economy was heavily mortgaged to Western bankers. And the military? The once unstoppable Ottoman war machine was entirely obsolete, bleeding territory to nationalist uprisings and Russian artillery. The Ottomans had become the Seljuks, and if the Ottomans were the new Seljuks, that meant a new version of the Mongols was already at the gates. This brings us to the ultimate explosive climax of this 700-year butterfly effect, the catastrophic collision of World War I. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire rolled the dice one last time. They allied with the German Empire, hoping to break the financial and geopolitical chokehold of the British, the French, and the Russians. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to regain their autonomy. They lost, and the punishment was biblical. In 1920, the victorious Allied powers forced the Ottomans to sign the Treaty of Sèvres. If you want to understand the chaos of the modern Middle East, you have to look at this piece of paper. The treaty didn't just defeat the Ottoman Empire, it functionally deleted it from the map. The British and French carved up the Arab provinces, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, drawing artificial lines in the sand that we are still fighting over a century later. But they didn't stop there. They went straight for the heart. They partitioned Anatolia itself. Greek armies marched into Izmir. The French occupied the south. The British took direct control of the capital, Istanbul. The Ottoman Sultan was reduced to a hollow puppet, signing decrees handed to him by foreign generals. He was allowed to stay in his palace, but his power was a total illusion. Sound familiar? It should, because the Allies had just recreated the exact same geopolitical vacuum that the Mongols created at the Battle of Kösedağ in 1243. They smashed the central authority. They occupied the wealth. They humiliated the local leaders. And they assumed the Turkic presence in world history was officially over. The so-called Eastern question was finally answered. The board was cleared, but the British and French made the exact same fatal miscalculation the Mongols did. They focused entirely on the official power in the capital. They were obsessed with the Sultan, the palaces, and the treasury. They didn't realize that in Anatolia, when you crush the center, power immediately and violently shifts to the fringes. When you compress a desperate, warlike people into a corner, you don't get submission. You get an explosion. While the Allied generals were sipping champagne in the occupied cafes of Istanbul, a mutiny was brewing in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of the interior. A mutiny led by a renegade Ottoman general who understood the terrifying physics of Anatolian history better than anyone alive. His name was Mustafa Kemal. You probably know him as Ataturk. Ataturk didn't just want to reform the empire. He knew the empire was dead. The bunker had collapsed. If the Turkic people were going to survive this new apocalypse, they needed to do exactly what Osman had done 600 years earlier. They needed to adapt. Ruthlessly and immediately, he completely abandoned the occupied capital of Istanbul. He headed deep into the harsh, arid steppes. He needed a headquarters that was untouchable by Western navies. He needed a fortress. He chose a dusty, seemingly insignificant railway town in the middle of nowhere. That town was Ankara. Let that sink in. The exact same battlefield where Timur had utterly annihilated the Ottoman army in 1402. The graveyard of Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, was now the launch pad for the ultimate Turkish resurrection. History wasn't just rhyming, it was screaming. From Ankara, Ataturk triggered a brilliant, ruthless guerrilla war. He didn't have a massive professional army. He had the remnants of a shattered state. He had starving peasants, smuggled rifles, and women literally carrying artillery shells on their backs through the freezing mud. But he had the one thing the Allied powers couldn't calculate: absolute, existential desperation. The Greeks, heavily backed by the British, pushed deep into Anatolia, trying to crush this rebellion before it could formalize into a state. They marched right up to the Sakarya River, just miles from Ankara. If the Greeks crossed that river, the last independent Turkic state on earth would be extinguished forever. It was 1243 all over again. The ultimate do-or-die bottleneck. Ataturk issued a military order that still gives historians chills. He didn't tell his men to hold a specific trench line. He told them to hold the entire country. There is no line of defense, but a surface of defense, and that surface is the whole fatherland. The Battle of Sakarya lasted for 21 days and nights of uninterrupted, apocalyptic slaughter. The trenches changed hands over and over in brutal, close-quarters combat. It was a complete meat grinder. But the Turkish lines didn't break. The shock absorber held. The Greeks exhausted their supply lines, their morale shattered, and they began to retreat. But Ataturk didn't just let them go. He unleashed a massive, perfectly timed counteroffensive that drove the invading armies all the way back to the Aegean Sea. The Allied powers watched in absolute disbelief. The empire they had just deleted had somehow rebooted itself in the middle of the desert. In 1923, the British and French were forced to tear up the Treaty of Sèvres. They signed the Treaty of Lausanne, officially recognizing the borders of the new, fiercely independent Republic of Turkey. Against all impossible odds, the descendants of the nomadic horsemen had survived the second apocalypse. But Ataturk knew that mere survival wasn't enough. If they kept the old Ottoman hardware, they would eventually be conquered again. The Sultanate, the Caliphate, the massive bloated imperial bureaucracy, it all had to go. He performed the most radical geopolitical surgery of the 20th century. He legally abolished the Ottoman Empire. He abolished the Caliphate. He exiled the last surviving sultan. He stripped away the Arabic script and replaced it with a Latin alphabet. He banned traditional clothing. He forcefully modernized the economy, the legal code, and the military framework. He didn't just defeat the Western powers, he reverse-engineered their source code. He turned a medieval Islamic empire into a secular, hyper-nationalist republic almost overnight. It was the exact same survival mechanism the Ottomans used after Timur crushed them in 1402. When the old system fails, you don't rebuild it. You burn it down and build a faster, more lethal replacement. The Mongols forced the nomadic Turks to become a centralized gunpowder empire. World War I forced the bloated Ottoman Empire to become a modern, agile nation-state. Every single time you try to crush this geopolitical node, it upgrades itself. This is the ultimate, terrifying beauty of systems thinking in world history. We often look at history as a list of dates, a dry catalog of dead kings, treaties, and forgotten battles. But history isn't a textbook. It's a living, breathing algorithm. It's an unbroken chain of cause and effect where the absolute smallest variable can trigger a global avalanche. If a Mongol commander named Baiju Noyan hadn't been so ruthlessly efficient at Kösedağ in 1243, the Seljuk Sultanate would have survived. If the Seljuks had survived, the power vacuum in Anatolia would never have existed. If that vacuum never existed, a tiny, insignificant warlord named Osman would never have had the political space to build his independent Beylik. If Osman's tribe never expanded, the Ottoman Empire never exists. If the Ottoman Empire never exists, Constantinople might have remained a Greek Christian city for centuries longer. If the Ottomans never captured the Middle East and monopolized the Silk Road, Europe would never have faced the crippling economic strangulation that forced them onto the open Atlantic Ocean. No Ottoman monopoly means no desperate search for a new sea route to India. No search for a new route means no Christopher Columbus, no Vasco da Gama, no age of discovery. The map of North America, the colonization of the globe, the flow of the world's wealth, everything we consider to be the bedrock of the modern world, was directly catalyzed by the unintended consequences of a single Mongol victory in a dusty valley in modern-day Turkey. The Mongol war machine was designed to freeze the world in a state of permanent submission. They wanted to end history. Instead, they accidentally pressed the fast-forward button. They built the engine that drove humanity into the modern age. And the descendants of those displaced, terrified refugees who fled the Mongol terror, they didn't just survive. They went on to rule one of the largest empires in human history, shape the modern borders of Europe, and eventually forge a republic that still stands as a massive geopolitical bridge between the East and the West today. The ghosts of Kösedağ are still riding. Every time a modern cargo ship passes through the Bosphorus Strait, every time diplomats argue over the borders of the Middle East, and every time the global supply chain violently shifts to avoid a regional conflict, you are watching the exact same geopolitical algorithm play out in real time. The board changes, the pieces change, but the rules of the game, the rules of the vacuum, the pressure cooker, and the inevitable explosion, those never change. The greatest conquerors in history thought they could rewrite the world with a sword. But the world is never rewritten by the sword itself. It is rewritten by the people who are left behind to clean up the blood. This is the greatest paradox of the flow of time. The destroyers of the world are the very blacksmiths who forge the future. When the hooves of the Mongol horses trampled the slopes of Kösedağ on that fateful July afternoon, they thought they had put an end to a chapter of history. They believed that by crushing the Seljuk dynasty, they had permanently extinguished the flame of the Turks on the land of Anatolia. But in reality, They had just performed a painful but necessary geopolitical major surgery. They cut away the old, hollow shell of a dying Seljuk Empire to reveal the steel core inside, a generation of Ghazi warriors with nothing left to lose and the whole world to conquer. We have gone from the ashes of 1243 to the fallen walls of Constantinople in 1453, from the humiliating iron cage of Bayezid at the feet of Timur to the brilliant dawn of the Republic in Ankara. Throughout that 7-century journey, a single red thread has always been present: survival through evolution. The Ottoman Empire was not a random entity. It was history's most perfect answer to the brutality of the Mongols. Without the suffocating pressure from the east, there would never have been the miraculous spring toward the west. Without the disintegration of the old order, Osman would have forever remained an unknown tribal leader on the frontier, and the name Ottoman would have been just a faint footnote in the chronicles of Central Asia. Look at the modern world map and realize the astonishing irony. The arrows of the Mongol cavalry inadvertently drew the navigational routes of Columbus. The trade monopoly of the Ottomans, a direct consequence of them occupying the void left by the Mongols, pushed Europe away from the mainland to plunge into the vast ocean, opening the era of globalization. This is not just a story of an empire rising from the ruins, but a testament to how history operates as a living entity, where destruction and creation are just two sides of a coin. The Mongols brought the darkness of devastation, but it was in that very darkness that the Ottoman sun was conceived and shone. The trap that the Mongols, and later Timur or the Western powers, fell into was always the same. They focused on destroying the symbols of power at the center while forgetting the fierce vitality rising from the fringes. They destroyed palaces, but inadvertently forged iron wills in caves and on the steppes. Every time a conqueror believed they had solved the Eastern question, they were actually just sowing the seeds for a new, stronger, more sophisticated, and more unstoppable version of their opponent. From refugee warriors fleeing Genghis Khan's sword to the Janissary armies that shook Vienna, it was a spectacular metamorphosis of a nation that turned fear into a weapon and chaos into a new order that lasted for 600 years. Now, looking back at the Battle of Kösedağ, we no longer see a mere defeat. We see a fulcrum of history. That was the moment the universe decided that for a true superpower to be born, it must be forged in the hottest fire of annihilation. The Ottoman Empire was the Mongols' most haunting ghost, an entity carrying the mobility of the steppe, but possessing the governance intellect of a modern centralized state. It was the perfect combination of the fighting instinct of someone backed into a corner and the vision of a global ruler. The rise of the Ottomans is a stark reminder that power is never lost. It merely transfers from those who hold it by violence to those who know how to use it to build institutions. The Mongols might have conquered the world on horseback, but the Ottomans ruled the world with law, with religious tolerance, and with an administrative system far ahead of its time. They transformed a lawless land into a pax Ottomana that lasted for centuries, connecting 3 continents and 2 oceans. This is the final and most profound lesson about the law of unintended consequences. A tactical decision on the battlefield can reshape the destiny of undiscovered continents. A cut from a Mongol blade could be the beginning of the greatest empire of the Islamic world. History is not written by those who win in a day, but by those who know how to turn defeat into a launching pad for a millennium. In the dark shadow of devastation left by the Mongol hooves, the Ottomans not only found life, they found a mission. and that mission completely changed the face of the world we live in today. The real treasure the Mongols left in Anatolia was not gold, silver, or land, but the very chaos necessary for a true superpower to be reborn from the ashes. That is the greatest paradox of the flow of time. The destroyers of the world are the very blacksmiths who forge the future. When the hooves of the Mongol horses trampled the slopes of Kösedağ on that fateful July afternoon, they thought they had put an end to a chapter of history. They believed that by crushing the Seljuk dynasty, they had permanently extinguished the flame of the Turks on the land of Anatolia. But in reality, they had just performed a painful but necessary geopolitical major surgery. They cut away the old hollow shell of a dying Seljuk Empire to reveal the steel core inside, a generation of Ghazi warriors with nothing left to lose and the whole world to conquer. We have gone from the ashes of 1243 to the fallen walls of Constantinople in 1453, from the humiliating iron cage of Bayezid at the feet of Timur to the brilliant dawn of the Republic in Ankara. Throughout that 7-century journey, a single red thread has always been present: survival through evolution. The Ottoman Empire was not a random entity. It was history's most perfect answer to the brutality of the Mongols. Without the suffocating pressure from the east, there would never have been the miraculous spring toward the west. Without the disintegration of the old order, Osman would have forever remained an unknown tribal leader on the frontier, and the name Ottoman would have been just a faint footnote in the chronicles of Central Asia. Look at the modern world map and realize the astonishing irony. The arrows of the Mongol cavalry inadvertently drew the navigational routes of Columbus. The trade monopoly of the Ottomans, a direct consequence of them occupying the void left by the Mongols, pushed Europe away from the mainland to plunge into the vast ocean, opening the era of globalization. This is not just a story of an empire rising from the ruins, but a testament to how history operates as a living entity, where destruction and creation are just two sides of a coin. The Mongols brought the darkness of devastation, but it was in that very darkness that the Ottoman sun was conceived and shone. The trap that the Mongols, and later Timur or the Western powers, fell into was always the same. They focused on destroying the symbols of power at the center, while forgetting the fierce vitality rising from the fringes. They destroyed palaces, but inadvertently forged iron wills in caves and on the steppes. Every time a conqueror believed they had solved the Eastern question, they were actually just sowing the seeds for a new, stronger, more sophisticated, and more unstoppable version of their opponent. From refugee warriors fleeing Genghis Khan's sword to the Janissary armies that shook Vienna, it was a spectacular metamorphosis of a nation that turned fear into a weapon and chaos into a new order that lasted for 600 years. Now, looking back at the Battle of Kösedağ, we no longer see a mere defeat. We see a fulcrum of history. That was the moment the universe decided that for a true superpower to be born, it must be forged in the hottest fire of annihilation. The Ottoman Empire was the Mongols' most haunting ghost, an entity carrying the mobility of the steppe, but possessing the governance intellect of a modern centralized state. It was the perfect combination of the fighting instinct of someone backed into a corner and the vision of a global ruler. The rise of the Ottomans is a stark reminder that power is never lost. It merely transfers from those who hold it by violence to those who know how to use it to build institutions. The Mongols might have conquered the world on horseback, but the Ottomans ruled the world with law, with religious tolerance, and with an administrative system far ahead of its time. They transformed a lawless land into a Pax Ottomana that lasted for centuries, connecting 3 continents and 2 oceans. This is the final and most profound lesson about the law of unintended consequences. A tactical decision on the battlefield can reshape the destiny of undiscovered continents. A cut from a Mongol blade could be the beginning of the greatest empire of the Islamic world. History is not written by those who win in a day, but by those who know how to turn defeat into a launching pad for a millennium. In the dark shadow of devastation left by the Mongol hooves, the Ottomans not only found life, they found a mission. And that mission completely changed the face of the world we live in today. The real treasure the Mongols left in Anatolia was not gold, silver, or land, but the very chaos necessary for a true superpower to be reborn from the ashes. History, ultimately, is not a series of isolated events or random victories. It is a living entity, a fierce current where every ripple of today carries the aftershocks of storms from 1,000 years ago. The story of the rise of the Ottoman Empire from the ashes left by the Mongols is not just a lesson in politics or military, but a hymn to the resilience and infinite capacity for self-reconstruction of humanity. It teaches us that, in the geopolitical universe, no destruction is absolute. When an old order collapses, it is not the end, but a liberation for new, stronger, and more enduring potentials. We often look at tragedies, defeats, or invasions as scars of destiny. But look at 13th century Anatolia. It was in the deepest darkness of enslavement that the light of a new era was conceived. The Mongols brought the sword, but they inadvertently gifted the Turks an anvil. And on that anvil, through the brutal hammer blows of time, a refugee nation forged itself into the sharpest blade the world had ever seen. The greatest lesson here is, pressure does not only crush the weak, it also crystallizes the most steadfast into diamonds. The rise of the Ottomans is the most eloquent testament to the law of unintended consequences. An arrow shot from the steppe in 1243 created a vibration across space, guiding Columbus's ships across the ocean in 1492. It reminds us that this world is connected by invisible, yet incredibly strong threads. The fall of a fortress in the east could be the very bell birthing a continent in the west. History does not operate according to the plans of conquerors. It operates according to the logic of adaptation. When we contemplate the journey from Kösedağ to Ankara, from nomadic tribes to a modern nation, we realize an eternal truth. The true strength of a nation does not lie in what they possess in times of prosperity, but in what they dare to become in times of decline. The Ottomans, and later the modern Turks, did not merely exist. They constantly upgraded themselves through every crisis. They learned how to turn chaos into order, turn hostility into motivation, and turn geographical limitations into global leverage. Ultimately, this story leaves us with a profound enlightenment about the position of every individual and every nation in the flow of time. Never fear the vacuums or the chaotic phases of life, for that is exactly where superpowers are born. The destroyers may occupy the present, but those who know how to learn from the ruins are the ones who master the future. History does not belong to the strongest, but to the most persistent, those who know how to turn the darkness of the enemy into their own dawn. The brilliance of the Ottoman sun did not begin from golden palaces, but from the very moment they decided to step out of the shadow of fear to rewrite their own destiny. That is the true legacy of Kösedağ, where a defeat became the promise of an immortal glory. The aftershocks of Kösedağ are not just a folded page in a book. They are a reminder that the world we live in is a tangled web of unintended consequences, where an act of destruction in the 13th century could be the impulse shaping the borders of the 21st century. If you are watching up to these moments, it means you are not merely looking for dry timelines or simple battles. You are joining us in searching for the algorithm hidden behind the rise and fall of civilizations, where power vacuums are always the premise for a new, more terrifying, and more sophisticated order. That is exactly why we built this channel, to dissect with you the layers of events, to see through the geopolitical butterfly effects that few notice. History does not repeat itself, but it always operates according to strict systemic laws. To not miss the major surgeries on how superpowers collapse and are reborn from the ashes, make sure you have joined our community of systems thinkers by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. This is not just about following a history channel, but a way for you to sharpen your vision to perceive the modern world through the lens of eternal laws. But the story of rising from adversity does not stop at the Anatolian Peninsula. If the brutality of the Mongol cavalry inadvertently forged the Ottoman sword, a similar loop, even more brutal and pivotal, occurred when the Ottoman Empire itself began to decline, creating a massive geopolitical hole that we still call the Eastern Question. To better understand how a superpower collapsing drags the entire world order into a new melee, click right now on the video displaying on the screen. That is the story of the moment the sick man of Europe took its last breath, and how it directly ignited the bloodiest conflicts in the modern Middle East. We will see you there to continue decoding the ciphers of power.